seen them actually pull people and take them out of the out of the theater for doing this.
Huh.
It's pretty entertaining. They watch it pretty close. They have some amazing fried pickles.
I'll have to see if I can.
You're making me hungry now, man.
I'll have to see if I can find the program I had from last year.
Sure. Sure. Oh, listen, Sharon, I believe you. I do honestly believe you, and I'm not arguing with you.
I'm
I'm
not
merely
arguing
just
with you either. I'm just
gobsmacked,
information.
right? Like, it seems so outlandish. That is only the reason I'm saying.
Why would you not want somebody to take pictures of your
has
charity
something
event,
to-
post them on Facebook, and say, "Hey, I'm at this great charity event," and then people see it, and then they look, and then.
Well, in the sake of my wife, who's a professional photographer, she's gonna take a picture of it, she's gonna put her logo on the bottom, and she's gonna use that to market herself. That is making money off of someone else's intellectual property. And that is why they don't want you to do it. Because they're going to produce a great product that they don't want someone to either replicate or make money off of.
There was a CD made.
Now, of course, I always say this. If you produce something awesome, the best thing you can do is advertise it. Because then more people are going to show up. And the average person is not trying to steal your great idea. The average person is just interested in seeing.
I don't even understand why it would be like that, because it's not like they're actually dancing that great. They're dancing for fun.
Right, it's a charity event. That was actually my first statement. How do you...
Savannah's, it's Savannah, right?
Yeah.
How many Savannahs in the audience that are professional photographers would, it's just most people.
And that is why Savannah brings model releases, and that is why she usually contacts venues before she shows up and asks for permission and gets a signature. So that
She's smart.
Yeah.
Because you don't want someone mad at you.
She's CYA.
Yeah. So does anyone else have any announcements or anything of interest? Okay. Well, so the next one, which is like middle of November, I think we're doing the. What do you call it? I'll go stand up here next month since I'm going to talk something official.
We're just all gonna hide in the corner from
I always feel that way. I always feel that way. There's just an array of people.
I'm waiting for next time. He's just going to move that entire thing over here.
If it wasn't for the convenience of this, I would stand nowhere near here. So the next event, which I think is, where's my iPad? I think it's November 5th or November 15th, or we'll find out. Because the internet is difficult. Events. So November 12th. We're going to do this things that make you happy. I'm going to try to make this a regular thing. So I think like maybe every month, every 2 months, we're going to meet and talk about projects we're interested, or technologies we're interested, or charitable events we're interested in. I mean, like, the point is it's 5 minutes, you give your spiel, you get try to garner some interest, and really the goal is that sometimes it makes you feel good, talk about things that make you happy. So like if you're having a hard day at work, go break that pattern, talk about something that makes you happy, get yourself back excited about it. Maybe it'll help you revive an old project you were working on, right? Or my hopeful biggest goal is that someone will latch on to your project and be like, I would love to help you with that. Let's chat, right? So I'm looking forward to that. That one's going to be a big one. But that means that I'm looking for people to contribute besides myself. And I understand that I have a large knowledge base and that a lot of the members of our group are busy and have jobs, and this is kind of an unusual kind of happenstance in Westmoreland County, and like Allegheny County, where there's just yesterday a Postgres database user group was launched, right? Like this is a general meetup. They have meetups about very specific kinds of software they use every day. So if you got a thing, what I'd love to do is I'd love to help you with your slides. So this is like, if you're going to do slides. You may not do slides, and that's cool too. I'd love to help you prepare. I've kind of a pattern for myself, and you can tell me what you want to talk about, and I'll tell you if I think that is too broad of a topic, right? Like to focus it for the 5-10 minutes. I mean, as you notice, I am currently in the process of trying to not give 4-hour workshops on these topics. I want to break them down to something that's a little more brain palatable, gives us more time to play, a little less time me talking. Kills my throat. So that's what I'm going for. So I'm going to try to take this tonight. Originally this is going to be like 5:30 to 10, and now this is going to be like 6:30 to 9, maybe, right? And at this point it's going to be like more like 7 to 9. So I've cut my slides in half. I've cut the topic we're going to cover tonight in half. So this will be 2 sessions then. We're going to get like the core stuff about Sinatra, and then we'll talk about building something in Sinatra next time. So my hope is, in between this one and the next one, you'll take what I've taught you here, and then you can apply it, right? So it should give you an opportunity to like try some stuff out on your own, and it's a pivot for you to learn by Googling effectively. So I'm calling this dynamic websites with Sinatra. So the last one we did was Middleman. Middleman is making static websites. So the real difference is that a static website is a web page that lives forever in the smallest amount of resources required. It is text files, it is images. It doesn't do anything special unless you bake some fancy JavaScript into it. If you have a business, if you have a marketing website, if you have a product you want to sell, 90% of the times that thing can be represented as a static website, because really the content isn't going to change that much. So content changes a lot in blogs, and that's where WordPress comes in as being a major player in that market. Unfortunately, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So when you're a web developer who knows WordPress, and I know it's going to sound like I'm kind of like squatting over WordPress here, but the reality is there's a lot of things you shouldn't probably make in WordPress that it's not great at. It's a pretty robust application that can produce some really wonderful things, but outside of a blog, trying to shoehorn a product website and e-commerce platform into WordPress, that's a painful process. Some people have become experts at that painful process, though. And WordPress has evolved over time into something that is both nice and dynamic. Now, that said, let me tell you an experience of my last company. Our main website was WordPress, and that was because we didn't want to share any engineering resources with our marketing team. And that sounds like a jerky thing to do, but our time, dollar per hour output, is better served solving like big problems that sell our product and not spending time bashing our heads against a website, right? So it's not really a matter of arrogance, it's a matter of budgeting and cost. It'd been better to hire like a web developer who worked at a different salary for a different department to manage their needs. So they wanted the marketing people to update their own website, which is fine. Except our website gets, I don't know, 1.2 million clicks a day, maybe. Because every student who logged in our system clicked through to from our website, almost every single one of them. So what that leaves us, it leaves us with a bunch of code, PHP code, running every single time someone wanted to get to our page the first time just to click a login button. Right? This would be better served with a static context, right? Because a static site is just web server receives a request, sends some text. But in the world of WordPress, web server receives a request, looks at an entire stack of PHP files, which then it compiles and executes, and then gives you HTML. That's a lot of work your server has to do repeatedly, especially if in between those requests, almost rarely is the content going to change, right? Over the course of a week, we would never change our homepage. So that whole week, it might have been repeatedly recompiling a bunch of code it didn't need to do. So we do caching. We have a thing called Varnish. Varnish would read all of our web pages first and then store them as static HTML. So whenever someone came to request it, we would just give them the thing already compiled, right? Caching on the web is a good thing. Now, of course, if you're a web developer and you got all the skills, then just make a static website and be done with it. You don't have to pay hosting fees. You don't have to pay. You don't have to pay for licenses for plugins, right? You just wrote the code, and you can do things like I do with these slides, and you can host them for free on GitHub at $0, and you're protected effectively by one of the best network operations teams I've seen. You know, so your site's almost never going down. It's never getting hacked. And updating it is Git. You can update your website just by pushing with Git, which is pretty cool. So that's why I fell in love with it. That said, there's this like giant jump. People use middleman to make these static websites, and then they use Ruby on Rails to make their applications. And that's not everybody, but that's been my normal experience working in the Ruby community, is that Sinatra, as awesome of a thing it is usually like a toy for kit projects. And, you know, I want to test the thing, so I wrote a Sinatra thing really quickly. And that's cool too. But it's something that we could use as a stepping stone to understand the robustness of Ruby on Rails and also augment the static nature of middleman. Right? So a website itself, as you see it, can look like a cohesive unit, but some parts of it can be static and some parts of it can be dynamic. And they can all live on the same server, and you have complete control over that. Right? So the end user sees a whole thing, you know that it's many parts. As opposed to creating a thing in one tool and then abusing resources because they're cheap. Well, they're cheap for a company making $17 million a year. They're not cheap for you and me, right? Because server fees are expensive, and we have jobs, and our revenue is not 7 figures. So dynamic websites with middleman, I call this massive success. Massive success is a quote from Frank Sinatra, that the best revenge is massive success. Right? So if you ever want to get back at somebody, just be awesome. And that's what I like to do as a developer. So I'm pretty happy with that quote. So because middleman is a framework written for making websites that happens to gladly and joyfully written on Ruby, but we don't really have to touch the Ruby language that much to make something nice out of it. Most of it, as you saw, if you were here, was Haml and Sass and other tools, and we touched Ruby just a tiny bit, just to install gems, just to make the tools available. In Sinatra, though, we're Ruby, right? We're using a Ruby DSL to make awesome applications. So we're going to cover the Ruby language, Sinatra, the request response pattern, and RESTful routes and data with data mapper will probably fall into the next session, because that's the heavy stuff. We might get to request response tonight. And for most part, that's a pretty easy thing to tack on. So Ruby, and a dynamic open source programming language with a focus on simplicity and productivity. It has an elegant syntax that is natural to read and easy to write. Ruby is created for programmer happiness. It's designed to be orthogonal in its syntax. Orthogonal meaning it works the way you think it should work. If you expect a method to be called a thing, it's probably called that, and you shouldn't be surprised by it. Ruby, to me, was my introduction into modern development. I was a Java engineer and PHP engineer and JavaScript engineer before JavaScript was fancy. So Ruby was beautiful, and it was small, and it made sense to me. The documentation was, and still is, and probably will continue to be, some of the best out there for anything. Things written in Ruby also have documentation that are very well. Ruby introduced to me a concept of convention over configuration. So if you're working in the Java world, you'll find that in order to utilize a particular library, you'll have to do a lot of bootstrapping, which is pulling it together, wiring it up, getting it started, and then you can go use it. Ruby didn't start this, but Ruby definitely was my first way that I popularized it to me. It made sense. Convention means that a thing should just work. Out of the box, stuff should work. And then, if you want to make something interesting, then you go and mess with it. Don't start by having to mess with it and wire all this stuff together and have all this domain knowledge. And that's what it is. You have to wire everything together first. You have to know actually how all the parts work and what their relationships are to each other. So usually when you start out with something, you have almost no domain knowledge. But with Ruby, with things built in Ruby, usually you can acquire them and they automatically work. Or you do a tiny, tiny bit of like You make an instance of the object that you're using, and it also then just works. Ruby is dynamic, and let's not get into that right now. That just means that you're not going to find a large amount of fancy tools, like, for example, NetBeans or IntelliJ, although JetBrains, the people who make IntelliJ, do have a wonderful tool for Ruby. You're not going to find a lot of that give you like much more than syntax highlighting. They're not going to tell you what the documentation of a method is. So it's very more like machine level than working with something like Java or .NET, where this IDE is helping you through the process and telling you what your constructor options are. That's something you're probably not going to find in Ruby. But you get used to it because every time you Google, how do I do this thing in Ruby, you probably get the Ruby's official documentation, which tells you all the methods, gives you an example of its usage, gives you the source code of how it was written. All in one place, you're already going to become an expert at the whole language pretty quickly. So this is an example of some Ruby. And I'm going to give you like further breakdown of this in a little bit. Variables are similar to what we have in PHP. So there is no declaration statement, there are no types. We do a thing called duck typing, which if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, probably a duck. So the first variable there is a string. It knows it's a string. You could ask it what type of variable is this and tell you it's a string. Because the first time it was initialized as a string. The same is true for the array. Methods follow def and then end. That's how we define our bounding. There's no curly braces. There are curly braces, but not in methods. And then looping, in the case of this language, everything is iteration over collection. So we don't actually write like for loops. We're always iterating over data. And this is what a sample Sinatra app looks like. We require the Sinatra library. We tell it that if anyone gets the root of our project, we're going to send them back the string hello world. That's it. That works. We're going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about it. This is the steps for getting a Sinatra project ready. I can put it on one slide. That's awesome. Right? That's including like extraneous project setup. That's the whole list. That's the whole recipe. So I'm pretty stoked about that. This is kind of the reason it becomes this kind of like, I have a toy project and I'd like to get it off the ground yesterday. You can build it in Sinatra in a matter of hours. And build the back end, the part that handles the data. So, I would advise you go here, tryruby.org. If you have Ruby installed, you can also run IRB from your console. IRB stands for Interactive Ruby. It is what's called a REPL. R-E-P-L. REPL. Many languages that are dynamic have these kinds of things. REPL stands for read, evaluate, print, loop. So like a program you would write, if you wrote some code for anything that had a, in an IDE that had a play button on it, it's a run kind of operation, you'd write a little bit of code, you hit run, you look at the output. Well, what a REPL is doing is it allows you to run the whole program, or each line of the program, one line at a time, but maintains the state of the program. So that means that you can set a variable, then you can print that variable on the next line. That variable stays in the REPL until you close it. So, anyone having problems getting the REPL open, or or anything like that?
Do I need to be in the Ruby folder?
Well, so so on OS X, if you got things set up the normal way, where it's installed by the system, it's just a command, IRB, in any of your terminals. On Windows, though, you had to install Ruby from, Ruby installer or Rails installer or something like that. That means they gave you probably a open command line or start command prompt with Ruby. That is what you need to open, and then you should be able to execute IRB from in there. Also, if you have Git installed, like the GitHub desktop, It comes with git bash. Git bash should also have access to your Ruby environment.
You don't need dollar sign.
Oh, yes. So
Dollar sign is
I forgot.
command prompt. That's where it leaves you.
Right.
Dollar.
So I'm trying to evolve my slides. In the past, I have put things like run and then tried to put the command in bold. And then because of the way the projector works, you can't actually tell the difference. It just says run this thing. It's just like one sentence. So for the purpose of these slides, anytime that you see a dollar sign, that's the command prompt. Anything to the right of that is what you enter.
It's a Linux thing.
It's a Linux thing, and it's also, I also did it because it's, as you're working through things, as you're looking at examples, that's how people are going to tell you to run things. So it's more normal to the way the documentation is written. And I want to make it so that your entry into Ruby is as pleasant and happy as mine. Tryruby.org is wonderful because it's a step-by-step tutorial on different Ruby commands and parts of the syntax. So without having to run anything on your own, you can just try stuff. We did it with try git on the Git talk, and that's the same thing. Somewhere else in some other computer, this is getting evaluated. Did everyone get that running? Try something?
I got IRB up and I got the website up.
Cool. So let's just type some stuff into IRB. Let's make a new variable. So pick a variable name, equals.
Just literally type it into the command prompt.
You type it into IRB. That's it. Yeah.
This reminds me of a lot of Python.
It's, in fact, yes, very similar. I don't actually know which came first, the Python or the Ruby, right? But the truth is that both these languages are similar in the fact that they're dynamic. Python has its strengths in certain areas, and Ruby has its own kind of nuance, I should say. But this is like a fantastic way to learn something, because if you write an error, that line of code errors, or you get the whole thing quits and you just start over again. So make a variable name equal to something, a number, a string, and then type puts, P-U-T-S, space, and then that variable, and it gives it back to you. Put string.
What is the reason that it prints out nil?
When you did the variable,
Yeah, whenever you like.
because every statement in Ruby has some return value, right? So you have a funny look, Gary.
Well, I'm thinking I just returned something and it returned nil too.
Okay. Well, so that's when you did puts. Right.
Right.
So puts doesn't return anything, but it does output text. So you should see the same text as you had in your variable.
What command to use?
I'm sorry, you make a variable in IRB, and then you do puts, and that variable.
A variable name equals something.
Yeah, so like a string something, right? It's got
Like-
quotes.
I said bunny equals, this is a bunny string, and it says bunny not recognized.
Let me see what you did. You're not in IRB.
Not an IRB.
So run IRB.
I thought that was IRB.
No, that's just the. So this is
Oh.
the hard part, right? So
Gotcha.
on Windows, we have to have an environment that already knows about Ruby. It doesn't inject it in the common one, although we can do that. Like we can make it so that your system always knows about Ruby. I personally like to just use git bash, because I like bash better than Windows command prompt. And they have a really good thing that works on Windows, does the same thing.
Now, is that IRB as well?
It runs IRB. IRB is just something written in Ruby.
See, I thought whenever I started this with Ruby, that it was done.
No. It just knows the command Ruby for IRB. So now type PUTS and space bunny. So you notice that the first line after the puts says what the value of the string was, and then below that it says nil. And that's because puts returns nothing, right? So puts is just a method, right? And not all methods return a value.
So the method's value is full, essentially.
Yeah, except we don't have that in
Yeah,
Ruby.
we don't have that. It's just essential.
Ruby does things a little bit differently, and we're going to see that. So this is the example of some variables. If you wanted to create an array, you can do that second line there. Ruby also has a very cool thing called inspect. So puts is like your normal, in Java, for example, system.out.println, or it's also like in JavaScript console.log. But sometimes you actually want to see the in-depth inner workings of a variable. And so if you were to recreate that line and then do the variable.inspect, you get a completely different kind of thing. It would tell you about its type. It would tell you about the object itself. And that's like your developer tool. By the way, developer tools in Ruby are really good too. So like debugging is a dream, by the way. We're going to get there eventually, but it's brilliant. What's wrong, Sharon?
Oh.
That's okay.
This one. Oh, I got it.
Okay. So anyone give that a try? Use inspect or anything like that? Yeah, try it. So do that thing .inspect.
Or do I do u dot inspect?
Whatever your
Or,
variable is.
yeah, that's fine.
It's you. I think maybe you are inside the block right now.
Oh, I am.
Hit type N. And then type puts you.
There we go.
Now down to u dot inspect. So it actually is giving you the escaped version of the array, which is pretty cool. Because most times Ruby arrays are almost the same as JSON. So like they're automatically deserialized, which is really awesome when you're working with things that are like on the web that want JSON serialization to go between services, right? Super cool. So let's talk about it, though. We were able to just say an array dot inspect. So we use dot notation on a variable, right? But what seemingly primitive variable. We can also do it on that string. A variable dot inspect will give us something less interesting, but there's a reason why. Now normally in other languages when we use the dot notation, right, what is that telling us? Anyone remember? It's an object. That the core thing is an object, and that's a method of that object. In Ruby, everything is an object. Absolutely everything. Every variable, every method, everything has methods that can go along with it. All right. It's an abstraction written in C to make programming easier. Right? So it doesn't mean it's losing any power. It's just giving up the verbosity for productivity. It does take the hit on speed, though. Right? You're writing little bits of code. It's producing large bits of code, which then have to be compiled and interpreted. So Ruby has its place in the world. It's not necessarily, I'm sure people can argue with me, particularly good at big math problems. Right? There's plenty of things out there. R, Java, C. They're great at it. Ruby's good at IO-bound operations and good productivity. And get a thing out there. So let's talk about methods. Methods are brilliantly easy, but they have a side effect that is unusual in some modern languages, and that is that they don't require a return statement. Every method in Ruby returns whatever the value of the last line is. So the first one, do something, is our common example of an identity function. Whatever we pass in, it's going to return. And of course, our second one is just a simple math operation wrapped into a function. But I don't have to put return on any of these lines. Whatever the last line is the one that the value of the thing will be. So if you write the sum function in IRB, for example, and then you run it, passing it two numbers, what you're going to get back is just the value, whatever that last line evaluation would be. And so in your puts method, well, I haven't looked at the source code in a while. The reason it returns nil is that either the operation that's on the last line is nil, or specifically they put nil, the keyword nil, on the very last line of the function to make sure that it always returned nil. They are easy, aren't they? They provide additional features, right? Methods can have default property values. They can accept optional properties. That's what that means. You make an optional property, which means the signature of the method kind of becomes somewhat flexible. And there's a pattern in Ruby to make that happen. But for the most case, yeah, you don't have to struggle much with this language.
Is there a, what is def short for?
Define.
See, now it makes more sense when we're using def.
Yeah, define. Now, the one thing in Ruby, and this is a style issue, is that in most cases, it doesn't require the parentheses either. So you could say def do something space argument, and it gets it. As long as there's nothing else that might confuse it. And it's really the same thing that would confuse you. So as long as there's like not some extra code on the same line, you can also call do something by just saying do something and space and a value. Now, from a style issue, Ruby people have they have done a very good job of making a concrete example of their styles. We make method definitions like this. We put the parentheses, but we don't call them with parentheses. So the call for this is just do something, space, some value or variable. The other thing Ruby does that's really awesome are blocks. Blocks are functional programming concept where we build almost like a temporary function of some logic, and they're usually wrapped around or applied to a collection or a loop, right? So I'm going to tell you, this is the example of a for loop. This is like the Ruby example of a for loop on the first one there. So because it's not like a thing we normally do, if I actually wanted to do something like that and I wanted to look like a for loop, I can do 1.3, which defines a range. And a range is like an array of all the numbers between 1 and 3, but it's lazy evaluated, which means they only get the number values when we actually ask for them. So if you think about it, if you wanted an array from 1 to 100, that takes up a fixed amount of memory space. But a range from 1 to 100 only takes a much smaller, because when we want the next item, it does the calculation then, to figure out what the next element is. So this is the difference in like lazy versus eager. So it uses up a little more CPU time per operation, but saves us a bunch of memory. So the way this works, the block is usually defined by either the do keyword or this more modern syntax which has curly braces. The Ruby style guide actually defines specific rules as to where you should use each. The two options are available. What's going to happen is, in 1 to 3, I'm going to have a loop that's going to iterate 3 times. There's going to be 1, 2, and 3. The dot each exposes an enumerable, and then it's going to call the body, the block, for each element. So for 1, it's going to call this thing like a method and say puts hot, and then it's going to do it again and again and again. It looks like a for loop. Now on the second one, this is how each can be applied to an array. I have the array 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm using the more curt syntax, more terse syntax, where we define our block. So the first curly brace is a do. This tells us what each element within our loop will be called. So it'll take one out, call it num, and then we can do work on num. This is going to print the array in the same order it is. In a lot of cases, that's like the core stuff that we use a lot. There are a bunch of other tools, and they're all beautifully documented. And when you realize you need one, you can have it. You know, like arrays use standard C-style array notation. So you can just sub-index and add elements. You can access elements in the same way. It also has a special extra elements like push and pop. Let you treat arrays a little bit more like stacks and other more advanced data structures. Alright, so Sinatra. Sinatra lovingly uses, or is built on Ruby. And since Ruby has such this small syntax and lets us define these really clever methods, they wrote what we call a DSL in Ruby for making web applications. And what is a DSL? We call that a domain-specific language. So, for the domain of making applications for the web quickly, they're going to give us a new set of methods, which are all written in Ruby, which are all part of the objects, and that's going to give us this wonderful website that it's going to create for us. So this is again, the simple Sinatra app. We have to require Sinatra. We have this get. We tell it the path, and then we give it a block. Now in this case, it's not going to do it more than once, right? But this is the activity it will take if we access that path. So let's go ahead and make a Sinatra project. And unfortunately, Markdown has kind of munged with my formatting. So what I'd like you to do first is exit IRB. You can do that by typing exit. So now what this is supposed to be is Sinatra _ app. That's what it's supposed to be. I tried to italicize it to bring it out. Unfortunately, the Markdown, well, it didn't see that correctly. It sees the underscore as bounding the app part only. So Sinatra _ app, and I confused it by using the underscore version of italicized. So you make a folder, you change into that folder. So you do CD Sinatra, whatever the name of the folder you created. And then we create a file named gemfile.
It's empty, right? Sure. Empty. Make directory.
mkdir. mkdir.
You like underscores.
What's that?
You like underscores.
Well, if you're going to be a Ruby developer, you're also going to like underscores because that is the standard for the language.
But an underscore for the name of a folder?
Well, you start underscoring everything. It's all like personal preference. The truth is, I would probably never apply an uppercase letter to a folder name or any path because different systems treat paths differently. For example, your Windows system is case insensitive on paths. That means that I have the same folder as you. Yours is uppercase, mine is lowercase. My computer, when it runs it as a server, will blow it up because it won't know what folder it is because the path is case sensitive. In your case, you name things whatever you want with weird capitalization all over the place, and the computer still knows what to do with it. The reality of it is, most of the servers I've ever seen in the world do not run Windows. They run Linux or some variant.
Alright, I can't change directories.
Okay.
Must be doing something else.
So change directory is cd space the name of the directory. If you're accidentally putting the underscore in front of cd, that is my fault and not yours.
I've done it about 3 different ways.
Okay, just type dir and see the name of your directories.
Hold on, do type.
Type dir to see what the name of your directories is.
It's because here you were typing underscore cd.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Type ls. ls will list what's in the folder. Lots of stuff. It's not going to have an extension. This file will not have an extension. It's just going to be gem file, capital G. That part's kind of important.
That's the mandatory file.
In Windows, I don't remember, unfortunately. So what I would do is just open up that folder in your editor. You use Sublime Text or Notepad++ or something like that. Any one of those would be fine. And then just save the file in there.
So
I would go to here. Who are you in? Adam. Yeah, there should be you should be able to add a folder to the project in Adam. That'll give you like a little sidebar with files in it. It's also convenient if you can figure that out. If not, yes, just use Adam. It's great.
That's what you use, isn't it?
I use Sublime Text still. We're all chomping at the bit to use Adam, but Adam's too slow.
Sublime.
So I like them both. But the spin up time, how fast. So let me put it this way. I've recently been helping somebody with a Java application, and it's been a long time since I've worked in Java in a web app. It takes 40 seconds for it to start up. That is an eternity to a Ruby developer. An absolute eternity. For example, your Sinatra application tonight will start up in about 3 seconds. It'll shut down in less than 1. Which means that when we look at opening and editing files, if it takes 4 seconds for Atom to open on a new file, we lose our fragile little minds. Whereas in the Java world, 40 seconds is, well, that's time to think about the next 50 lines of arbitrary code you're going to write. So there's my hating on Java now. But, all right, everybody got a gem file?
Can't even find my Sinatra. I'm in the directory, but I can't find it.
Is it because it has an underscore in front of it?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm at the root of C.
So you are technically in your home directory here. The tilde slash in git bash would be your home directory.
Yeah, right?
Yep, and there it is. One down. You can cursor down with it.
Yeah.
That's it. So if you're using git bash,
Okay.
tilde slash is not the same as just slash, right? Tilde slash is an alias for your home directory. It's just to make your life easier because in the Linux world, you only have access to your home directory. Like the segmentation of responsibility is the root owns the system and you own the folder in the system.
So what am I making? Just a new text file?
New text file, no extension. Make sure you don't have any extension on it.
Oh, no extension?
No extension. It should be just gem file.
Text document. How am I going to add its own extension?
if you deleted it.
That is always a trick. One of the things that first drew me to an editor like Sublime was it was much easier to create a file without an extension. It was, yeah. So everyone's got a gem file. Cool. So this is what goes into your gem file.
Use easy to create new text file, and it'll show up as whatever dot text, delete the dot text, and then try to save it, and it'll yell at you, and you can tell it to go away. No, really, that's what I did.
Notepad++ should let you get rid of the extension too. CP. CP would be correct for Linux.
Yes.
Hey, if you ever get a chance to take the Linux class,
Next semester.
take that. It's
I'm
good.
taking it next semester.
And it's a good class.
I'm about to start going back to my home group and do all this stuff in Linux.
So if your computer is relatively fast, get VMware and just make a VM Notepad.
But I do have Exubuntu on a VM, and it runs way faster than I thought it would.
Of course.
The only thing I'd ever run on it before was Windows 7.
Oh, Windows is so heavy. It's so heavy.
Painful.
And so because of good programming,
Oh, this is kind of type of something.
separation of concerns, right? Single responsibility principle.
Right.
Your operating system itself's core driver should not be responsible for also generating windowing information. And I know that may sound like an abstract concept I just brought up, but I'm gonna go up there and talk about this. You guys can check it.
So we're actually using double quotes there on the HTTPS.
They are interchangeable.
Are we actually putting that in the file?
That's going in the file.
Okay, that's what I wanted to ask.
So one of the reasons that Windows is so heavy, of course, is because it doesn't do the separation of concern with windowing. Linux itself is a command line tool and kernel that's actually pretty fast. It's got most of the features of everything else, just they're not always baked in all together. And then there's the X server, which is the thing that makes the Windows. And those two things talk to each other at super high speed. And that is it. So your X Ubuntu is just like X server and possibly what, X FCE or something,
Yeah.
right? Which is a super lightweight like windowing thing. It doesn't leverage graphics. It doesn't really do anything. It's ugly too. But the truth of the matter is, because the kernel is so small and it's only communicating what it needs to tell this windowing server what to do, and that windowing server is taking control of that responsibility itself, they both have a contract with each other what they talk about, but the resource usage is really low. So you can run a VM on a computer that's not terribly fast and run this thing, and it's cool, right? The Mac takes that a step in the other direction. They say we want all the like separation of concern stuff in Unix, and then we want to make this really robust interface that doesn't use the X server, uses some other or fork of it in a way. And then it gets kind of heavy again. So that's why you have to have 16 GB RAM in your Mac anymore. Or your sad panda. Right, well,
Oh, I got, this is,
yes. Well, first off, also you need to make that G capitalized. For the gem file? Yeah, it has to be capital G. Alright, source.
That I can do.
That looks good. Yeah.
Notepad plus plus won't let me save it without a.
Download Sublime Text because it's awesome.
it's cool, 'cause it's dark.
And it's cool because it's black.
Yes,
And you can change that theme to all kinds of wonderful other colors.
I'm good with black.
I will do anything to not be in a blue PowerShell session. Bright, vibrant, like Ford blue.
Line text.
As Ford blue with white text. That's all I gotta say. PowerShell sessions. Of course, you can customize that too, but I mean, like, that's what it comes out of the box with. Convention over configuration. Out of the box, it should be beautiful and work.
Have you seen the command prompts that are translucent?
Yeah. In fact, I have one on my computer. I have a Quake-style terminal on my computer. I hit a key press, and a drawer slides out from the left with my terminal in. And it's translucent. There, for Windows, one does not exist that isn't a nightmare to configure, and probably would use a lot of resources.
Yeah.
But it's become.
Machine at least.
So my next purchase, I'm looking at a new computer, and I'm thinking about ditching my Mac because, to be honest, I installed the last version of Ubuntu 15.10 in like 30 minutes. I didn't even have to touch it, right? Completely unattended install. Just done. And it works. And Unity doesn't really stink that much anymore.
No?
It worked. It worked. It looked nice. Applications I opened fell in there. It didn't lag.
Is it still the same thing with the launcher bar on the left?
Yeah, but they more people have put their applications in the application center. Debian packages don't open in their own installer window. They open in the application center. So you get like an app store experience. They've stolen everything from Apple. At the same time, they've done a very good job of stealing from Apple.
I have 14.10 on Flash, or 14.10.
15.10 is just, I'm super impressed. And it supports hybrid displays, which is one of the reasons I was keeping with a Mac, is I want my system to switch between turning the graphics card on and off. And so if your computer has what they call a hardware mux for the graphics display, then Linux, and especially 15.10, supports. Hey Mel.
Hey.
15.10 supports that hybrid display, so it'll switch for you. So you get all that like super awesome battery life, which is really all we're ever looking for in life. Is a computer we don't have to plug in for the next 6 hours unless we're doing heavy work. Anyways, so everyone's got that? Everyone's good? It's okay. Take your time. No need to super rush on this. I've purposely cut down the amount of information so that we can have these stopping points, still feel like we've accomplished something, and then go home without being tired.
Turn off the extension
Sublime just put that, it makes whatever you tell it. She was using Notepad++, and it forced you to put like a text extension on her gem file. So in Sublime Text, of course, it puts whatever you tell it.
It shouldn't.
And I don't think it will.
No, I mean, Notepad shouldn't even do that.
It does.
If you take it off and you try to save it, I think if you don't change the little drop down,
I did change the drop.
she changed it,
You
so-
can't change it to nothing.
interesting. Oh
I
well.
know I used to save extensionless files with
Same
Notepad++.
It's been too long. I'll just say that.
I don't remember how.
I don't remember. You get spoiled, you do things a different way, and then you completely forget what you're doing.
I just did a clean folder, create new text file, you know.
In
gem
Sublime.
file, and then I deleted the text.
Oh,
I saved it, it yelled at me, and I told it,
Yeah.
Oh.
piss off, and it
Yeah, that's
just
what I
created a file.
So I did. I was too late. It was a lot easier to right click and create new text file than it was to actually find Notepad. And then when I went to open it,
Yeah.
it asked me if I wanted to use Notepad++, and I was like, sure,
Okay.
works.
So what you did is you deleted the extension and then opened it.
Right.
Yeah.
Created the file, saved it, and then,
Remove the extension and then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I have it set up on my computer where it shows the actual extension in the name, so I don't have to search for it. Because I don't like having to search for things.
I switched to
Less
Sublime.
work, the better.
Yay, Sublime! Only because Adam's slightly too slow for us, like speed freak Rubyists to deal with. It's really it.
tries to make us nervous.
So I was just. So we all got this. We all have a gem file now. Okay. So we may have to actually install Bundler first before we do this. You should have it. You can always just run gem install Bundler. Bundler. Like the verb version. Gem install Bundler.
Using the Ruby one,
Yep.
the
Gem install Bundler. 90% of the time, if you've done anything else with Ruby, then Bundler's already installed. So you probably don't need to do it. But if it already is installed, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to be like, Bundler, this version is already installed.
Yeah, it's just kind of confusing.
It takes a little while sometimes. Because it has to go out and talk to an external server. So while that's waiting, we'll talk about what Bundler is doing. Well, Gem, we're currently installing a library. But our gem file is kind of the manifest for how Bundler knows what other gems to install. So when Bundler is installed, when we run bundle install, in any directory that has a gem file, it's going to go out, it's going to get those gems, it's going to install them for us, and then it's going to create a lock file, which tells us what versions those dependencies are at. One of the benefits of this is you share your project with somebody else. You give them that lock file as well. When they run bundle install, they won't get whatever the current version is, they'll get what version has been listed in the lock file. This means that everyone you share your project with will have the same stuff. That's kind of super important. Because there are changes that happen between versions of, say, like Haml or SAS. That because you started your project a year ago and I'm looking at it now, enough time has passed that when I install SAS again, maybe it doesn't fully support the feature you had. But because I'm going to look for the exact feature that the lock file tells me, I won't have to run into that problem. So how are we all doing? Everyone saying they can't connect to the internet?
One gem install.
Cool. So once the bundler's still doing its thing, the RI
I
doc.
installed it down here, but when I did bundle install, it definitely stopped.
Okay.
Yeah, I always get that DL is deprecated, please use fiddle.
Still. Whatever.
That's what it tells me.
I'm with you, man.
I think I posted that on Gitter and your response was the same.
I don't know what fiddle is, so I'm gonna have to now look it up. This is if you're using Bash, you usually can modify Bash to have things like autocomplete. Like pick the ones you want, put it in your init script, and then Bash can autocomplete. But Fish probably does something like they're already built in, or they're more efficient.
Actually, it just like it will autocomplete commands as you're typing them, so it'll give you like look ahead for
Ah,
arguments and
that's pretty. I like that.
yeah.
That's
So you
cool.
get this like kind of gray ghosty looking
Mm-hmm.
text.
You just hit right.
Yep.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. Is it?
So
Does it?
it's basically auto suggest actually is what it has, rather than just autocomplete.
So does Fish diverge from Bash too much? Like.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So the reason I haven't used Z shell is because it's too different. The things I'm used to aren't there, or they're different.
Fish is very different. It's like the scripting language is nothing alike at all. So if you're using custom scripts, it's
Well,
not better. It's,
you shebang the script and then it doesn't matter.
but I love it.
Cool. Okay, so bundle install has executed correctly for everyone. So you should look in your folder at the gemfile.lock, just so you get an idea what that looks like. So you should have a gem file and a gemfile.lock in your folder now. When bundle install ran, it should have created a gemfile.
I had a gym file. No, not part of it.
Interesting.
You
Oh,
don't?
they've actually found.
Could not fetch from each. So this is the thing where we have to make it not SSL.
Okay, right.
Is that right, Mel? When it says it can't get from the SSL source because we have a bad certificate or something here, we change it to the HTTP one.
That should work. Yes.
Okay. So let me go back to this other slide. We're just gonna try something real quick.
I don't have anything but gem file.
That's fine. That's because it didn't actually install anything. So because the SSL certificate here is privately signed because they're cheap, this S has to go away. So it's HTTP instead of HTTPS. And then it won't try to make an SSL connection, and it'll just go over the web, which should work. What happens? You make an SSL connection here. It then the browser says that it can't sign it properly. You go, whatever, dude, just do it, and you move on with life. But bundle's not smart enough, or intentionally doesn't want to do that. For security reasons, allow you to accept the bad SSL certificate. Nothing. Save it, uninstall, nothing happens. Could not fetch specs from.
Sorry, probably does because we're in.
You have an S on the end of your word.
What do I know?
Too many S's.
You told me to move the one, I just didn't.
He's like, well, there
Do you
needs
need
to
to
be.
run gem install
change
bundle
this.
again? Because we removed the S?
Yeah, so save that file, make sure you save it, and run bundle install again.
I'll run bundle install again.
Yeah.
Hey, extinguish.
Bundle
Awesome.
install, wait, what do we run, the gem install bundler or bundle install?
Bundle install. So we did modify this file, take the S off it,
Okay, bundle install.
and then bundle install.
Woohoo!
Remember, not that part. That's just to remind you that it's terminal command.
Checking if I can bundle install using.
Take good batch if it's all.
Use bundle
Take good
gem.
batch if it's all.
Should let bundle gem is installed.
Right. So, if you got some feedback, go look at your gemfile.log. It's just interesting.
I'm still a good file.
When you ran bundle install, what did it say?
It says,
You're doing gem install bundler. Do bundle install. That thing.
oh, my bad.
Read the board.
I heard you wrong.
It's one and then the other.
It was one and then the other is. Yeah. Normally you always have bundle it, so you don't install a lot. You install like once in your default gem set, and then every gem set since populated gets it. Right? Unless you do the one thing like me and make a gem set without it, and it punches out every single time making a gem set.
And then look at it.
Yeah, and then check out your gem file log. Awesome. Yeah, so check out your gem file log.
Yes, it is. You check.
stuff that Sinatra needs to operate. And what Bundle did is Bundle looked through your gem file, then looked through the dependencies of all the stuff in your gem file, of all the gems, populated a big old tree, and then went and collected them all for you. So we didn't have to think about all the extraneous dependencies, just the big ones. We know we need Sinatra and we'd like Hamel. That's what it gave us. So now we're going to create our application. New file, app.rb. It should be lowercase. You know, slides for readability always make, you know, everything capital. But app.rb all lowercase.
This is the gem file, right?
This would be in the same folder as your main file. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to require Sinatra. Let me just talk to you a little bit about what gems are from the programming standpoint. So a gem is a folder full of source code. Having a gem file, having those gems installed means you should be able to access them. What Bundler will let you do is lets you know, it'll keep track of where those gems are installed for you based on what you have in the gemfile.lock. So when we type require Sinatra, that's like, for example, a Java include path. That's us saying, please make this library available within this program. Now when we require it, it exposes the API of Sinatra. That's where we get our gets. There's other things, puts, matches, things like not match, put and post. The REST API stuff. It actually makes those methods available inside of our file. If we did not require Sinatra, we would not be able to call the method get. It does all that automatically. Super convenient and beautiful. So that means your program is now the source code for Sinatra as well. It's everybody's source code. Everything in the gemfile.lock is compiled together with your application when it's run. So even though you can't see any of that stuff and it's hidden off in a folder somewhere, you're still going to be using it. So anyways, we're going to do the require Sinatra, and then we're going to do get / and then we're going to open a block. Get is what a web browser does. It's the action it takes through the HTTP protocol when you request a URL. When you type something in the address bar and hit return, it makes a GET request. Web servers, on the other hand, will receive the GET request, and then they route it accordingly. So normally a GET is for like a file, right? We get some file. That was the old days of the internet. And so the browser would see GET and see a path, get an address and a path, and it would resolve it down to which file and send the file back to you. In most cases, that's what the web still does today. But we want things to be a little bit more fancy. So in this case, the web server routes the request to this file. It then matches the path. So this is the same as our app's path, localhost / the root of it, the very basic part of the domain. And then we are going to execute the stuff in the do block when that matches. All right, and it's going to send the string back hello world. Okay, so if you all got that in there, everyone doing okay with that? Everyone got it typed in? Cool? So now we're going to run our app. Now, we're going to add a little something at the beginning of this that I should have thought of earlier, and usually I'm very opposed to because I use RVM, but we're going to do bundle bundle execute, right? No. Bundle execute?
EXEC?
Yeah, right. I'm just making sure because it's been a while since I've run this. So it's the same as this, Ruby app.rb. We're doing bundle exec in front of it.
You shouldn't usually do that, but sometimes you do.
I don't know where their gems are. I don't know if bundler is automatically going to go and find them. This is like what I Like, if you don't know where your gems are and maybe things aren't working right, bundle exec should almost always work. We can try it without, but for the sake of making everyone work too hard. So what this is doing is it's saying, bundler, exec this code with your gems. So that things that are in your gem file, things that are in the gem file.lock, will be in context of running ruby app.rb.
Usually it's only necessary if it's possible that you have like another Ruby version and other versions of gems, but everyone should have a single Ruby.
You're right.
So
You're right.
that shouldn't be an issue.
I started thinking about this about half an hour ago. Is that just for safety's sake, since we installed bundler, we're talking about the relationship with bundler. I know if you use RBM or RVM or any number of like helpers, they make this problem never happen, right? It's like always organized. All right, anyone get an error when they run that?
It's just sitting there.
Yeah, think about it.
Okay. Sinatra has taken the stage. Sinatra has taken the stage.
Take
Lots of
the
key-
stage.
Yep, that means you can go to http://localhost:3000. Sinatra spins up a web server on port 3000 on your machine. So Internet Explorer can be really tough on localhost sometimes.
I don't know to connect.
The port might be 4567, not 3000.
That's true.
Ah,
It should tell you in the console output. Yeah, wherever you ran Sinatra. 4567. I don't know why mine says 3000. All mine run on 3000 for some reason. I probably have set an environmental variable somewhere that says port, capital port equals 3000. And I effectively broke. So if that doesn't work, 4567 is the port. And it should say hello world.
I came close.
We need game close.
It doesn't know this date.
Because you're going to 4567/sample layout. There's an argument error in your code, so you have something
Ah.
linked incorrectly.
Hello.
So I think that it inserted that variable thing. Yep, cool. So let's look at your source code.
There was a weird variable for me.
Save it again,
Deleted
then.
it.
Oh, you'll have to rerun. So if you make changes to your source code with Sinatra, you have to restart it.
We gotta exit.
Control C, and then press up, and then press return. That's my magic, Konami code. Kill the process, press up to get the last command, press return to execute the last command. There's probably something easier, but that's mine. I like all my key things that involve both hands. So I feel like a pianist again.
looks like behind it.
I love piano. It's like my favorite thing. I just haven't done it for a while.
I could never get everything coordinated.
Oh, I loved it.
Well, after playing 10 minute sax and one note at a time, I just couldn't move at all.
I can't do the drums, but I love piano. I don't actually see a lot of difference between the drums and the piano.
Really, really slow.
Personally, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like the piano's a percussion instrument, so are the drums. Why can't I do the drums? Because I don't want to put enough practice and my ears hurt.
Well, you use drum pad.
And I didn't know that when I was a kid. I thought you had to have a full thing. I'd never even heard of a drum pad. My parents were so opposed to it. What can I say? Things that happen to me when you're a kid.
I can do a roll if I crush it, but I can't do it otherwise.
Is it backslash or dash?
if you've given it something that's reasonably spelled right up to the point you hit the tab.
It should be better than that.
Just know what
Well, that's supposedly what fish shell is doing. It's super smart. Now, how does it do with misspellings, Mel?
What do you mean?
If I start misspelling a command, does it give me good suggestions of what the right command would be spelled correctly?
Probably not.
Okay.
I know of there's a plugin that I installed with a vulgar name. If you type it afterwards, it will recommend commands that you might have meant.
That's cool. I like it. So everyone got Hello World.
Yes.
We all made your first dynamic web app. Every single time you go to that path, it executes that Ruby code. So, let's make it harder. Now, let's make it more beautiful. Let's involve views now. So it's one thing to make a web page that's just a piece of text, but that's not very interesting, right? We want web applications. We want to send HTML forward. So we do it in Haml because it takes less space and time for us to type it. That's why we included our Haml gem. So first thing we're going to do is going to make a views folder. So at the root of your project, make a folder named views. That's plural. V-I-E-W-S.
Okay, it's still like,
Hit Control C. That will end. Sinatra has ended his session. Proud of laws. In that folder, you'll create something called index.haml, H-A-M-L. So, folder name views, in the folder, index.haml. Looking good? Okay. Let's put some stuff in our Haml file then. So remember, Haml syntax is percent symbols before elements. So that's an H1 tag with the content Hello Sinatra. So it's percent H1 Hello Sinatra. And then I put your own name in there, and not mine, unless you really like me that much. This is a P tag, paragraph tag, with the contents. Secondary.
So glad we spent a whole semester learning HTML.
This is an HTML templating language. It lets us make HTML smaller. That said, Sinatra can serve both HTML and Haml files side by side. Sometimes you might have an existing HTML file. You can make Sinatra serve it. Make a new file, you can make it in Haml. Or not. Your choice. And I mean, the truth is, it's your choice. I love Haml. I love all templating languages except for Mustache. It's called Mustache because it's got these little curly braces. It's got two of them. That's called a mustache. You have two curly braces. It's called a mustache. Two curly braces, same direction, right next to each other. Okay, everyone got this? Yeah? Sharon? Good? Okay. So now we're just going to modify our get in our app a little bit. We're going to call Haml. So this is a method. We're calling this method Haml. I think we might actually have to require Haml as well. We'll see if we get there. If that's the case, we'll require it. I can't remember if Sinatra auto-loads Haml or not. I think I tried this before. We'll see. Yeah, so we're going to see real quick if we have to require Haml. Who's good? So where we have require Sinatra, we just have to add below that require and then Hamel in quotes.
Oh,
How do I rerun this?
Control C, that'll kill the process. Then up. Yeah, right, terminate. Then up. Yep, and then return. It's not available.
This is what I got.
Interesting. Guess I'm just gonna try it myself. Let's see what I did wrong. Okay, exit presentation. Make this get out of my way. Guess iTerm didn't get started for some reason. Oh, okay. It doesn't like the string. I think it wants the symbol for the views. Is that what it wants? Or what's going on out there? Yeah, I didn't think I had to include require Hamel, and I don't. Let's just change the name of it. I can make this bigger. Oh, Sublime Text. There we go. So I don't exactly remember why it doesn't accept the path. It probably automatically knows to look in the views. So let's just turn index to colon index instead. Call that a symbol. So instead of that string views.
cool index, you use the Hamel too, or?
Nope, keep the Hamel.
Huh?
I'm sorry. I meant that Hamel. Go ahead. Yep, there you go. See that.
Maybe.
No quotes.
Oops.
And no Hamel extension on the end. So it's just colon index.
Colon index.
Colon index.
Oh, colon index.
So,
There we go.
The Hamel colon index?
Hamel space colon index. And that's it. No quotes, nothing. It should turn, if you're using Sublime Text, turn purple. And we should get proper formatting. So Sinatra, when you include Hamel, probably already somewhere it's baked in that your views are only useful with.
so views is pretty standard.
Views is very standard. In fact, you go from this kind of thing, and we're going to eventually build this application. I'm teaching how to connect to your database and how to do all kinds of neat stuff with Data Mapper. We can make this. We can basically make an entire website in one file aside from our views, which is pretty neat.
Yeah.
And then take that what you learned, and you go and you start Rails, and it's all the same stuff. They've just simplified some of the logic, like how you make things. It's a little bit simpler, but everything goes in the same place. Like your views goes into views, and other things go in places that are the same. So you won't be lost when you get there. So like you start middle and end, you learn about like the tools that Ruby is common in Ruby to make some application. Then you go to Sinatra and you say, well, this is how I make an interactive application. And then you go to Rails, and Rails is just more stuff layered on top, but it's really all patterned the same. So my goal here is that We do the next one. We talk about RESTful services. We talk about how the endpoints should be organized per standard, and we talk about how to get data in and out of it. And then we can move on to Rails later. And then we can make really ornate, complicated things. Not that you couldn't make complicated things in Sinatra. Rails provides us better organization, better tools to make it so that our code is less clunky. They call it Ruby on Rails because it's Ruby web development with a laser focus. You get on the Rails, you do it their way, and things are going to be great. If you want to do something weird, go spin up Sinatra or Lotus or Roads or something else that also provides you some web framework that lets you do things differently, right? So it's an opinionated framework. All code is opinion, right? So it's a very opinionated framework, and the guy who kind of like invented it is also a very opinionated person. Sometimes I think he's opinionated just to make himself look good. I mean, like, to garner more attention. Sometimes. He's also kind of a smart guy, right? I mean, he kind of like had this really good idea. And then other people glommed onto it, and the community supported it, and now it's developed en masse, endlessly. And that's it. That's what I got. I feel that's a pretty safe place to stop, and if we want to play around with it some more, we can. But no more need for slides. Is kind of my point. Let's get rid of the slides now. Which means I'm also going to kill the live stream.